Good morning, everyone. Wanted to welcome you to the session this morning on affordability and post-secondary opportunities in rural communities. I am John Furr, the Executive Director of Education Systems Center at NIU, one of the network organizers along with Advance Illinois and ISAC of the 60 by 25 network. And I'm really excited for the session this morning. I think it's very important as we talk about our overall state goal for 60 by 25. While we have the universal goal for 60% of Illinois adults to have a post-secondary credential or degree as part of that, we know that we can't get to that 60 by 25 goal unless we're thinking about targeted strategies for different populations across our state and really thinking carefully about what we need for various populations to be supported for post-secondary access and for post-secondary success. And that's nowhere more true than for the rural communities throughout our state, and really thinking specifically about what are the needs of students in those communities and how they can be best supported to be able to have access to college and success to complete college as well. So that's what the session will be focused on, and we've got some fantastic speakers that will be able to guide us through that conversation. First of all, we have Dr. Kyle Westbrook, who's the founding executive director of the Partnership for College Completion. It's an organization that has been around now for 5 years and has really become a true driving force within our state for supporting policies that are helping more Illinois students to have success to and through college. And they've really had a tremendous focus on issues of equity for Black, Latinx, and rural students throughout our state as part of their focus as well. So Dr. Westbrook will be kind of walking us through some of the findings from their 2019 report, Priced Out Rural Students on Illinois' Disinvestment in Higher Education and What Can Be Done About It. So we're excited to hear the information from him. And we also will be hearing from Dr. Jennifer Garrison, who's the superintendent for the Vandalia School District, but also serves as a board member for the Illinois Board of Higher Education. So she brings a very unique perspective to this discussion as well. So she'll be able to provide us more information again around how these issues of affordability and access are playing out within the Vandalia community and how there can be some strategies in other rural communities across the state to address these important issues. So we encourage you as we're going through, we'll be monitoring the chat box. Just please provide your thoughts and your questions, and we'll make sure that those are addressed as we move into the discussion part of this session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Westbrook. Kyle.
So thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you, Emily, for the opportunity to speak to the 60 by 25 convening today. And thank you to Dr. Garrison for all that you do, not just for this presentation, but on behalf of our students and our communities, and really for our state, wearing the multiple hats that you wear. And so I'm thrilled to present the work, and I won't claim it as my own. I will give credit to Mike Abramson from the Partnership for College Completion, who is the lead author of this report. And I think I saw him in the attendee list. So when there are, questions that my little brain won't be able to handle, I may be able to tap Mike from the audience, at least in the chat box. So let me give you just a little bit of background about this report and this series of reports that the partnership released back in 2019, in the fall and winter of 2019. The reports would come as really a culmination of a series of discussions that we at the Partnership for College Completion have been having about the disparate impacts of Illinois' really, frankly, unprecedented, historic, and nation-leading disinvestment in higher education over the long arc of about a 15-year time horizon. And so we, instead of sort of trying to, tackle the issue from the macro, what we decided to do was to zero in on a few specific subgroups in the state that would have been affected by this disinvestment. So I'll talk a little bit about the reports in general, but for those of you who don't know who the Partnership for College Completion is, I will just orient us to our mission. As John said, we've been around for 5 years now, and our goal is really to increase college completion rates in Illinois with a specific focus on low-income students, first-generation college goers, Black and Latinx students. And the way that we feel like we can do that is through championing policies, systems, and practices that ensure all of the students in Illinois graduate from college. And so that is why the opportunity really to present to the 60 by 25 network in the audience here who are working at our community levels, working at our system levels, is one that, of course, we could not turn down. A little bit about our work, the Partnership for College Completion. Sort of how do we think we can sort of move, how we can accomplish that mission is really through three big broad areas of work. The first is in public policy. So we do actively engage our lawmakers in Springfield, and we do actively pursue and advocate for policies that we feel like will create the right conditions for student success in Illinois. The second area of our work is in public awareness, and that's really about how do we elevate a public discussion about college completion and the barriers that students are facing, and really trying to broaden the tent of folks who are concerned about Illinois' higher education system and its ability to serve all of our students. And a third area of our work is what we call technical support, or college university partnerships, and that is work that we have engaged in with 26 colleges and universities that have all pledged to close their equity gaps in degree completion. And so our role with those colleges and universities has been to first lead them through a planning process where they have looked at their data, researched practices, and put together what we call an equity plan for how those institutions are actually going to close those gaps. And so we couldn't be more thrilled to be working with that set of institutions, some of whose representatives are on this call. The report that I'm going to talk about today, it sort of sits at the nexus between public policy and public awareness. And that is certainly the research and data that Mike compiled for this report tells a compelling story, or the series of reports tells a compelling story and a compelling narrative about disinvestment and its impacts on various students. But we also think that that narrative is important in service of a larger public policy goal of improving affordability in the state of Illinois and thus increasing access for all of our students. As I mentioned, and as John highlighted, this report was the third of a series of reports that we launched in the fall of 2029. The first being a report focusing on Black students, the second on Latinx students, and then we were pleased to work with Jennifer in Vandalia to launch the Rural Students Report in Vandalia with an audience from community stakeholders there. And so you might be, before I sort of dive into the report, you might be asking sort of why an organization based in Chicago that is has worked, many of our folks have worked mostly in the Chicago area, sort of what's the particular, why rural students, and sort of why the focus there. And it's threefold. The answer to that question is sort of threefold. The first is, as John mentioned, we will, as a state, never get to our statewide attainment goals if we aren't being very strategic and very focused about all of the populations in the state and their ability to access higher education and their ability to complete. The second reason is really a response, frankly, to some of the concerns that we often hear when we're talking to state legislators about some of our policy work and policy agenda. So for instance, when we are often engaging state legislators in Springfield about advocating for increased MAP funding, which we think is critical to improving some of these metrics that I'll lay out in this report, what we often hear is, well, MAP's not really, it's not really an issue in our district, or it's less of an issue in our district. And when we look at the data, we see that the ability to pay for college it cuts across geography in our state. It cuts across counties, it cuts across representative districts, and it is a fundamental problem for students throughout the state of Illinois. And so we saw this report as a way to broaden the discussion about how we fund our system of higher education in the state of Illinois to make sure that it is inclusive of all the populations that are affected by it. The third is just very personal to me, and that is I grew up in Southern Illinois and have deep family roots in Southern Illinois, know many of the communities, many of our rural communities, particularly in Southern Illinois and Central Illinois, know those communities very well and know that the opportunities that frankly some of our students in the Chicago and suburban areas take for granted are opportunities that our students in rural communities just don't have and would have to travel hours in order to access those opportunities. And so there's certainly a very personal stake in this report and the desired outcomes on my part. I encourage folks to visit the website, partnership fcc.org. There you can engage the report and some of the interactive data features. I won't walk us through those today, but as you have time, I encourage you to spend some time and you can really drill deep into some of the data and some of the outcomes and how the partnership put these reports together. And so at a high level, I'll summarize the major findings of the reports. The first and sort of largest, of course, is that 17 years of disinvestment in Illinois has created unique affordability issues and concerns for students in Illinois that have disproportionately affected Black and Latinx students and rural students. And certainly the declining enrollment, we've seen obviously a declining enrollment in Illinois public institutions. And I'll talk really quickly about some of the findings from Black and Latinx students reports before diving into rural. For Black students in Illinois, there's particular access issues insofar as the system that should be encouraging upward mobility is actually limiting it. Black students are underrepresented at some of the institutions in the state with higher payoff for their college degrees, are overrepresented in for-profit enrollment, and this can lead to increased borrowing for Black students and intergenerational effects on their wealth and preventing social mobility. And for Latinx students, the story is in some ways good, but not great. As we know that the state has seen, increased enrollments, increased K-12 enrollments of Latinx students, but Latinx students enrollment in four-year degree has not kept pace with the overall student growth. And there's a particular concern amongst many of our Latinx students about taking on borrowing as a way to finance their education. And this, as folks have called debt aversion, can play a significant role in limiting their access and their outcomes. For students, there's particular dimensions that are unique. And there's question or concern really around the fact that there are, in fact, some rural students who can actually afford to go to college, but those who can afford and often do go to college aren't able to actually return to their communities because of the high cost of education. And we know that rural students also face access challenges when it comes to just their ability to attend colleges, especially four-year universities. And we know then that that can have an impact not just on their own family income and outcomes, but also on their families and their communities. The report itself is divided into four sections. The first, and we'll walk through these sections, looks at access. The second looks at cost. The third, the ability to pay, and the fourth, payoff. And so within access, what we're really thinking through is the students' pathways through college, sort of by sector and within sector, and then within different institutions. And then when it comes to costs, it is the price that students pay by race and by location, by an ability to pay, looking at issues around wealth, income, and borrowing, and state aid, and how that affects persistence and completion. And then payoffs looks at what the graduates actually sort of get from a degree. And obviously this is impacted tremendously by workforce policy, but this can lower how much a student pays, and which affects this equation, and also looking toward debt forgiveness. So in terms of how the partnership sort of defined and looked at rurality or location, the data comes a lot from survey data and some national research, and some research within Illinois that really look at different classifications of urban, suburban, and rural. And so you'll see that by census tract, you'll see how the rural is defined, and it's really about the percentage of a county that is determined to be a rural, whether it's a mostly urban county that is greater than 50% mostly rural, that is less than 50% urban, or completely rural, where the percentage is less than 1% urban. And I think about, again, my hometown, Centralia, Illinois, which I think from the census perspective would be categorized as like an urban center because it's around 13 or 14,000 folk. But when you look at the rest of the county, when you look at the rest of Marion County, you see a very, very different picture. And so I would suspect that it would probably fall in one of those mostly rural categories. And then in terms of colleges, we look at colleges that are serving areas with few or no public alternatives. And this is particularly important when we look at the distribution of our public universities, and some of those universities, college universities, where there is no other public university alternative, certainly within hours of driving. And though we know community colleges are very well spread out and distributed across the state, our public universities are not so. So high-level findings from the report around access. We know in rural communities, rural students are largely attending community colleges. We see lower bachelor degree attainment rates in rural communities, but higher associate degree attainment rates. Rural students actually complete their associates at higher rates than other communities, than folks from suburban and urban communities, but they transfer at lower rates. And so you can then see how the result could be lower bachelor attainment rates, though at higher associate degree attainment rates. And the good news here is fewer of our community college students are transferring to for-profit colleges. And I say the good news when we look at some of the cost for our for-profit institutions and the ways in which they can saddle students with a tremendous amount of debt. We know, of course, also that rural students face a tremendous challenge when it comes to accessing four-year universities. And so this slide really looks at college and university, where they are located. And you'll see that college and university serving areas with few or no public options, and they're more selective, and they're serving fewer or lower percentages of adult students. And within those institutions, we see large completion gaps by race. And overall, we know our state public university system has been facing a declining enrollment challenge. Rural community colleges, on the other hand, they serve larger percentages of first-time, full-time students. And we know that private colleges, if you look at the map here, private colleges are incredibly inaccessible for students outside of the Chicago area. And one of the things that's, I think, of note about Illinois, the Illinois sort of higher education ecosystem, so to speak, is the degree to which Illinois, unlike a lot of states, has a really healthy balance of private colleges, community colleges, four-year universities. But outside of the metropolitan Chicago area, that imbalance is noticeable when you consider the ability of rural students to access particularly four-year universities and private colleges. We know from 2011 to 2016, the population of high school seniors in our urban areas, there was virtually no change. Yet we know in our rural areas, we are seeing declining numbers of high school seniors. I'll jump ahead a little bit here, but in general, the lower income communities in our rural areas are correlated with higher high school population loss. And rural students are disproportionately attending public colleges and universities, as we'll get into in just a second. So from an access point of view, rural access to four-year degrees is a growing challenge. And so we have to think about how do we improve the enrollment and transfer pipelines for students from rural communities. And there's some promising work that we see happening in the state in terms of those transfer pipelines. And we also have to look at what are some of the outreach and access successes that we've seen with institutions like Northern Illinois University that have gone test optional, and the ways in which standardized tests can become one of those other barriers to student success and access. And really, how do institutions improve and strengthen their outreach to rural communities? And we see this even with one of our more elite universities in the state, the University of Chicago, that has been really aggressive about outreach to our rural communities. Cost and ability to pay. I'll move into this area, so I know I'm running a little bit over, but I think this chart and this graph, it really tells a story about cost in Illinois. Illinois universities are really, really incredibly costly, and they're 50% higher than the Midwest average in terms of the net price that students pay. And we know that sticker price can be a tremendous obstacle for students, particularly low-income students in both rural and urban areas. Insofar as our students see a sticker price that says, $30,000, and will often throw up their hands and say, I can't. There's no way I can afford that. And we know that that the challenge really around undermatching is an ongoing one. And I want to just highlight this particular chart because I think it drives home some of the fundamental challenges that our students face, which is on the bottom side of this chart, you'll see the average net price for different institutions by sector. So our community colleges, slightly over $5,000 per year, public universities in Illinois, a little over 15,000, private colleges at 20,000 on average, and for-profit institutions being the most pricey of the sector at almost about $23,000, $24,000 a year. And then at the top, you see the students' average household income across these sectors. So students who are attending community colleges and for-profit institutions have about the same household income, less than $40,000. Yet we see, of course, the price of for-profit institutions being the highest, which again speaks to some of the challenges that our students will face in terms of debt. Similarly, when it comes to our public universities, typically our public university students are higher income, and then our students that are attending our private colleges, universities in the state of Illinois are the highest income. And we see this as a particular challenge insofar as the institutions, particularly for rural students, that they have the most access to are our community colleges, which are certainly the most priced, that are most affordable. But students have least access to these two entities in public universities and private colleges. Significant, as you might expect, significant gaps in terms of income across rural and urban communities. And so I will, I'll move past this so we can get to the rest of the presentation. But a few takeaways from cost and ability to pay. Cost affects access early in the pipeline insofar as it can be one of the factors that can dissuade students from applying to certain institutions, and that we need to reinvest, frankly, in our MAP award and through our appropriations to our public universities and community colleges. And we would argue that that reinvestment should also be very targeted. In terms of payoffs, high costs for colleges can exacerbate some of the rural economic challenges insofar as low-income area populations are declining faster in our rural communities. And we know that degrees have higher payoffs in cities. And the way that this kind of can manifest itself is you think about a low-income student from a rural community that may be experiencing population decline. In my hometown of Centralia is an example of that. When I was a kid, it was around 15, 16,000 people, and it's down to around 13,000 now. And so population's been declining over the years. And so for students from rural communities who may in fact go to college and get a degree, often there is less economic opportunity for them to repay their debt back in their hometown or in their home community, in which can exacerbate some of the challenges that rural communities face in terms of attracting and retaining talent. And so from our perspective, we want to put forth a vision for the future that provides for more equitable access to higher education, and recognizing that funding can improve equity, and to get students going into college with more and more clear and greater information about the resources that they have available, and more clear pathways to success. And this is where some of the work that's being done at places like Kaskaskia College around transfer pipelines is critical for our students. And there's no substitute for dollars, and increasing our students' ability to pay is paramount to the PCC's policy agenda. And we have to think about also how do we lower the cost of higher education, especially for institutions that are serving underrepresented students. And this is particularly true in our rural communities as well, where we, even in the first round of GEAR funding that came as a result of COVID-19, it was often our community colleges in rural areas that actually benefited the least from those resources, insofar as the first equation did not adequately capture part-time students and adult learners. And so we've got to think about how do we improve just the overall funding mechanism for our institutions. And for-profit institutions, from our perspective, should not be supplemented with state aid. Those dollars, MAP dollars, frankly, should be going in larger proportions to students that are attending our public and private institutions in the state. And the payoffs for a degree, and this is obviously going to be a longer haul to really begin to think about how do we invest in and improve the economic opportunities for folks in rural communities, so that the payoffs for that degree are such that they can afford to go home, and they're not burdened with debt, and can afford to go home to their rural communities if that is their choice, rather than being in some ways forced to attend or move to other areas of the state because they simply can't afford to pay down their loans. So I will end, and thank you for your time and attention. And Mike's on this call. He's probably going to shudder when he sees his email address on here, but Mike is, like I said, the architect of this report, and questions, feedback for the report. We look forward to the Q&A here today, but also if you have other questions, you can email Mike at mabramson@partnershipfcc.org. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Jennifer now.
Thank you, Kyle, and good morning. So just a little bit of background. I'm Jennifer Garrison. I'm the superintendent of Vandalia School District. I'm also a graduate of Vandalia High School. So I'm finally back home. And when Kyle called me back in 2019, asking if I was interested in learning more about the Partnership for College Completion and the Rural Report, at first my thought, and I'm glad he shared his story, at first my thought was, why does Kyle in Chicago have any interest in Vandalia, Illinois? Well, come to find out, Centralia and Vandalia are only about 30 miles apart. So I'm in Fayette County, and I'll start with the November 6th date because we in Fayette County had some of our best students attend. I mean, we picked our elite group that could help us advocate from that student voice, who reach into all of our Fayette County high schools, bring that student voice to the table. And as Kyle was presenting, one of the ladies, the seniors, pulled me over and she said, I think you need to hear this. I think everybody needs to hear this. And when she shared it, it was my awe moment. Like, I thought I knew my community. I thought I knew my county, but I realized in my 40s now that I even have to realize I have to amplify my student voice. And what she shared for the Fayette County students is, most of them feel, juniors and seniors, that a scholarship, not a MAP grant, but a scholarship from a university is their only path to college. And I have just taken that with me from November 6th until today, that we as adults really need to listen to our students and put them at the table. Fast forward to, that was pre-COVID, fast forward to this week at the IBHE strategic planning meeting, our student board member shared, and this is where I connect the Black, Latinx, and the rural reports all together. From the student advisory committee, she shared the exact same thing. Our students, now we're in the middle of the pandemic, hopefully moving out of it, that our students statewide only see scholarship as an opportunity, which speaks volumes to the affordability and access. Now I'll go back down to the micro level and just give a few examples on some of, as we're working on the policy work, what we in the high schools need to think about, and our counselors as we're working with community colleges and our universities. When the pandemic came and we went into the shutdown, I had worked with a young lady because she knows my background. I joined the military to pay for my college because my dad worked in a factory and the factory closed. A typical rural America story. But she was in a little bit different situation and just felt she could reach out to me. So we have dual credit courses from Kaskaskia College, but some of her barriers that we might not think about was a book, having a book to take the dual credit course, because she was required to buy the book. Then fast forward to the pandemic. So just these small things of the affordability picture, from the micro to the macro perspective, it was, she did have a scholarship. She did find her way to Eastern Illinois University. but there was this down payment she had to make for her dorm room that wasn't covered in the scholarship. So once we finally got her into my office to talk to her, the three adults in the room was like, okay, who's getting out their credit card because she is going to college. So when we go back to the macro perspective of how we look at this from a policy perspective, there are so many layers in that cost and the access and that affordability. And I'm blessed that I have the opportunity to sit on IBHE as we go through our strategic plan, which is for the next 10 years. Everything Kyle reported is real, and taking that from the practitioner to the policy perspective and back down, how do we increase those communication loops so rural communities feel that they have a voice and that we're connecting with our workforce? Some other things I want to highlight, the transfer pipeline, the articulation agreements. My community college is a great example of our students taking the dual credit here need that guarantee that it will go to their 2-year degree, or we have that 2 and 4 year articulation. So my one community college out of the entire state, that's really been their focus. And we're so appreciative of our community college that they understand that dual credit is only effective if that credit can go with the student and then it counts. And that it needs to count at U of I too. I mean, we need to have some of these conversations. When Kyle said rural students usually attend public college, I have my doctorate. All of my degrees are from public universities. If you go to the IBHE website and look at all of us, I almost stand out as the rural voice on higher ed because all of my degrees are from public universities, and I'm proud of that. And then test optional. I know that we need to start talking about some of these at the policy level, more uncomfortable conversations. This is me speaking for me, just so everybody knows. I'm really seeing that right now. And as we go out of COVID, we've learned to open our minds more during this time to provide for our students. So instead of closing that door automatically, how do we look at what some of these universities and community colleges are doing right now? We have beautiful equity examples all over the state of how they've reached out to their students. But the reality is those wraparound services and what we're doing with test optional policies for 1 year, why can't we talk about that for opportunities for the next 20 years? And I think we want to open this up for Q&A, Kyle, so I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I wanted to share a little bit about how appreciative I am of Kyle and the Partnership for College Completion and putting the rural voice at the table, and also for the governor and the governor's office for giving me a seat at the table to bring the rural voice to higher education.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I'm just going to sort of echo something that you just stated in terms of, COVID-19, and in some ways, if there is a silver lining in this, it is the ways in which all of our institutions have adapted to this environment. And, test optional is just one of those examples of policies that were implemented in many cases out of necessity for our institutions of higher education. And I share a fear that I know many have, which is, once the pandemic is subsiding, a fear that we have is that we'll just sort of go back to business as usual, and not examine the impact that policies such as test optional are having on increasing equity, access and equity on our campuses. And I'll just give you one really good concrete example from my own experience as when I was still a high school teacher, which is had a student who was frankly one of the students who had the greatest kind of academic ability of the thousands of students that I taught over my years. Student had a bad day when they took the ACT, was sick, and didn't score that well, got their test scores back, and said, oh, I'm not going to apply to X, Y, and Z college because my ACT scores were low, and this was a student who didn't have family resources that they could just continue to retake the test, et cetera, et cetera. And consequently, this student with incredible academic prospects did not enroll in an institution, frankly, that could have capitalized on their promise, and didn't wind up not graduating from college. And I share that just as an example of a way in which had test optional practices been in place long ago, I won't date myself, that this student, I suspect, would have had greater access to institutions that would have served their long-term interest a little bit better. And so, I share, and I know many folks on this call would share some concern about not sort of going back to policies that were putting barriers in place in front of our students. So I will open it up for questions in the chat. I see a few questions in the chat I'm going to try to address. And I think Mike might have addressed this, but I will double down or sort of reiterate. There's a question about our private colleges in Illinois. Do they reflect the same sort of inflated pricing? And Mike's response, they cost more than public universities. Their prices aren't greater in Illinois than most states. So in other words, that there's nothing uniquely pricey about Illinois private colleges and universities compared to the rest of the nation. And it's often true, as Angie points out, that there are greater, often financial aid packages in terms of gifts and institutional aid at some of our private colleges and universities than our public universities. And so you can, again, begin to sort of knit these threads together, which is private colleges and universities are geographically less accessible to our rural communities. And we know a great many of our students just want to go to college somewhere relatively close to home. And so if you have private colleges, which often do offer greater financial aid, yet they are farther away and less accessible to our students, you can then begin to see how rural students are not served as well by this kind of rich private college ecosystem that we have in the state of Illinois, which could benefit them a little bit more in terms of some of the aid that they are offering. And I'd be remiss to not mention the governor's investment in Aim High, which we know is incredibly controversial in many ways, but it reflects an attempt on the part of the governor to recognize that our state public universities need more flexible aid that they can award to students, again, to keep our students in the state. Let's see if I'm going to go, see if there are other questions that have popped up. A couple of comments here. From Daryl, local Kiwanis group offering $150 per semester for dual credit. Students have to commit to 10 hours of volunteer work and speak at the Kiwanis meetings. These local service organizations are eager to help. And I think that your comment really about what are the local resources that can be made available to support students is one that is particularly important, whether it's through groups like the Kiwanis or local foundations that are often smaller, in our rural communities, but some kind of philanthropic giving, whether it's from individuals or businesses in our rural communities, can make all the difference in the world when it comes to our students' ability to access and persist in higher education. So let me pause there and see if there are other questions that come through the chat. I think we still have some time.
And I can throw out a few more probing questions, and I think people can unmute their mic as well if they want to join us for a conversation. I think Emily said that was an option.
Sure
so
thing.
From the IBHE perspective, working on our strategic plan, two of the questions that we are to wrestle with, which I would like your input since we have this opportunity, is from a policy perspective, should we set a target for dual credit at our local high schools? So I'm wondering what your reaction is to that. I'll share what my reaction was. I said yes, because we need to incentivize our community colleges to work with us to find a way to support our students. If you're working in a unit district or a high school district right now, you also know our barriers to get our teachers licensed for dual credit. So another idea the Strategic Planning Advisory Group has suggested as one of their bold ideas is to integrate that into the teacher ed prep program, kind of like, I'm going to date myself, kind of like what we did with the middle school endorsement back in the day. But obviously this would be content specific and integrating those 18 hours again into our teacher prep program. So then when I hire a high school AP chemistry teacher, he or she can provide AP and that dual credit option. So our students are getting, I mean, to me, my answer was yes, and here's why. But if anybody, whether you're from wherever you're from policy land or working in schools or community colleges or universities.
I'm just gonna say, I think that makes complete and total sense, Jennifer. I think to me, the challenge is on the latter part of what you talked about in terms of the credentialing aspect of it. Because when I worked in the Chicago Public Schools, we did a pretty exhaustive study of teacher qualifications in our various high schools. And unfortunately, and it won't surprise folks to know that when it came to our sort of least resourced and our high schools that were serving largest proportions of Black students and Latinx, the faculty on in those high schools were often had the fewest credentials that would allow them to offer dual credit courses compared to our selective enrollment high schools where there's multitude of faculty that have those credentials. And so I think to me what you just mentioned in terms of we've got to also invest, it's one thing to require, but we also have to invest in our teachers to allow them to get the credit hours that they would need in order to be qualified to be those adjunct professors at their community colleges. I think that is spot on.
Yeah, I appreciate what both of you are saying. And certainly we have some great policy frameworks in place with the Dual Credit Quality Act and the Model Partnership Agreement that sort of, once you get people to the table of trying to develop and offer dual credit, that there's some really helpful frameworks for figuring out what that looks like, divvying up cost and the responsibilities, et cetera. But the teacher qualification issue is something that is a perpetual challenge. And I know it's not unique to Illinois, but Jennifer, to your point, how do we incentivize the post-secondary system to proactively be team members in that effort, right? As opposed to just sort of waiting for a secondary district to come to them to say, hey, we want to do dual credit, and how do we make it happen?
First, I'm really optimistic about the IBHE strategic planning process. For those of you who are in the K-12, sort of steeped in K-12, the Illinois Board of Higher Education has been convening a set of multiple stakeholders from multiple sectors over the last 4 or 5 months to really put forth a vision for Illinois higher, to develop a strategic plan that puts forth a vision for Illinois higher education that is centered around access and equity for all of our students, and recognizing all of the challenges that our students are facing, whether they are in, Carbondale, Illinois, or whether they are in Chicago, and thinking about all of the various work strands, or what are all of the different levers that the Board of Higher Education has at its disposal to push and increasing access, and knowing, of course, that money is ultimately going to be part of the equation. I'm encouraged by the folks that are leading that process and putting forth what can, I think, hopefully be a very bold vision for higher education in the state of Illinois that really is centered around the fact that not all of our students in all of our communities have access, and how can we improve that. I think that it's a unique moment, and I'm really excited to be working with folks from the IBHE and helping to develop and build that out, and the voices at the table that are inclusive of rural communities and folks in Central Illinois, Southern Illinois, Western Illinois, et cetera. I'm just really, to me, that's one reason for optimism. The second reason for optimism is really, I think it's part of a broader national discussion that folks, I think, are realizing now that when we've had these conversations about equity, we've often not centered rural communities in those conversations. And so I'm encouraged by a broader national awareness that though the challenges that our rural communities face may be different from those in our urban communities, the fact that they're different and unique does not mean that they are not worthy of being addressed. And so there's, to me, a bit of optimism that we're thinking about our challenges that our students face more holistically, frankly, than we did even 5 years ago, when so much, or virtually all of the conversations centered around our urban youth. And Illinois is a big state with lots of different, communities, lots of different types of communities, and each of whom deserve access to higher education and access to the ability to lift their families out of the economic position that they're in. So
I just had bullet point. We have a few more minutes, so I'll take them unless somebody else has a question on the access. I know the conversation is going into at the university and community college level of we've learned to do things differently. So we need in-person, we need maybe the hybrid type option, and then we need the remote only option to continue to give our learners, adult learners, more options. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the digital divide. That those opportunities will not be available to our rural students from an access perspective unless we continue from a national and a state perspective to advocate for broadband. I have 221 square miles. Some of you probably already heard this. I live in the middle of Vandalia. I have to come to my office to have reliable connectivity. If my child was and remember, I'm talking about me, my family. If my child was doing his remote learning at my parents' house out, 15 miles out in the country, he might get internet for 30 minutes here and there, and he would not be effective. He's only a second grader. He's not college bound, but still, that access point is just exacerbated through the pandemic. We've always known it's here, but now the world, or the United States, Illinoisans can all see that deep equity barrier that we're facing as rural Illinois.
Yeah, certainly challenges that already existed are being laid very bare and exacerbated by the current challenges that we're facing. And just thinking about sort of the multi-layered effects of the pandemic and not only being able to, and Jennifer, you were mentioning this sort of before we even hopped on here today, just about the journey that Vandalia has been through and other rural communities that have been through when it comes to the pandemic and the experience of higher rates of infection at different points and how that's going to impact everything. Certainly keeping an eye on how all of those interconnectivities come into play, and figuring out how this 10-year plan for IBHE and higher ed generally in Illinois can try to address these issues longer term as we're still in the middle of it. Any other questions or reflections folks have for Kyle and Jennifer?
I just wanted to, I've been listening to the conversation, and I'm staffing the design work group for the strategic plan for educator workforce preparation. And wanted to just share that one of the strategies that we've been discussing with our design work group in terms of educator preparation programs are 2+2 agreements between community colleges and four-year institutions, so that and these exist, but they need to be much more sort of widespread and systemic, offered at a systemic level, so that students could actually complete their degrees at their community colleges with that 2+2 agreement, where the using a cohort model or other models where the four-year would offer those courses right at the community college. And so even though we're talking about educator preparation programs, this is the type of model that could definitely be used in all kinds of different degrees. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as another way that, potentially completing a baccalaureate degree could become easier and more accessible to students in rural areas. Thank you, and thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you, Sophia. And I think that is a really, the notion of the 2+2 and what's a true 2+2, which we know we have institutions that have negotiated really strong kind of bilateral agreements between Community College X and four-year university Y. But how do we sort of think about that sort of systemically from a policy perspective that doesn't require the kind of individual bilateral negotiated agreements, but says that as a state, we believe that our students at our community colleges, especially in areas that are relatively isolated geographically, that they should have access to those kinds of programs on their campuses, so they don't have to either drive for 2 hours or 3 hours to get to a four-year university, or just sort of give up on the idea of a four-year university degree because they don't want to pick up and move to Macomb, or they don't want to pick up and move to Charleston, or their family situation may actually prevent them from doing that. And so I appreciate that discussion that you guys are having, and how that could be one of the levers that we pull on. Folks on this call, some of you know, I've said this on a number of occasions, that we need, frankly, like a university center south. And for those of you that don't know, the university, we have a entity called the University Center here in the Chicago area in Lake County, which is the sort of hub of four-year universities that are, in pre-COVID times would teach in-person classes. So there's, a dozen colleges, universities that sort of share that space, and it's right across the street from Lake County, College of Lake County, a community college. Frankly, I would argue the need is even greater in Southern Illinois for that type of a hub, where we could see different universities being able to offer access to four-year degree programs. And in what you were saying, Sophia, absent a university center south, perhaps it is at our community colleges as an extension of our four-year system.
That's a really great note. Taking these pockets of excellence that we see and systematizing them through policy and other mechanisms in our system is really essential. And that's a core philosophy of the 60 by 25 network. That's part of why we exist. So I just want to say thank you again to Jennifer and Kyle for sharing your expertise and your work, and for doing the work that you do, and for being a part of the network. And thanks to everyone who is on the line here today. Everything's being recorded and put on the conference website. So if you've missed anything, we will be sharing all of that. And just appreciate all of your time. Thanks so much.